The IMF has recently upped the growth forecast for India for this financial year from 6.8 to 7%. You seem to be more bullish at this moment than the Ministry of Finance itself. I want to understand, what is it that you're seeing in the Indian economic story at this moment which has led you to increase the growth projection for this year?
Rahul, so firstly, India's growth did much better than we expected the last fiscal year, and those carryover effects are affecting our forecast for this year. The other factor is we see private consumption recovering. Last year, if you looked at private consumption growth, it was around 4%. But we expect that to increase, driven by the recovery in rural consumption. We're already seeing that if you look at two-wheeler sales and if you look at the so-called fast-moving consumer goods sales, you're seeing that coming back up. The better monsoons that have happened, we expect will generate better harvests, and because of that, with agricultural incomes going up, we should see a recovery in rural consumption. So those are the two factors behind our upgrade.
And do you see this recovery in consumption, because that's really been one of the biggest topics of conversation here, that consumption, especially in rural areas, hasn't been growing. Do you see this as being sustainable or just a short-term blip in recovery?
Yeah. So last year, an important headwind was the weaker monsoons, the weaker crop output, and that hitting rural incomes, which was one of the factors that affected consumption in the rural areas. So we see that changing for this year. Now, that said, of course, there is the need for more general structural reforms in the economy to bring about higher growth. We have medium-term growth for India at around 6.5%. Now, at these numbers, India will remain one of the fastest growing, the fastest growing G20 economy in terms of major economies of the world. For example, 7% growth rate for this year would contribute about 17% to global growth. So India is a bright spot in the global economy in terms of its growth rates. But in terms of bringing up overall private consumption and so on, we think some of these factors will play a role. But more generally, structural reforms, which the Prime Minister put a lot of focus on in his Independence Day speech, is going to play.
So let's spend a moment on the structural reforms you think are most important at this time, because there is also a new political reality in India with this government not having a full majority. For the growth numbers to rise from the 6.5% that you're projecting over a medium term, what structural reforms do you think the government needs to tackle first, given the uncertain political play out of those reforms when they've been attempted in the past?
Right. So there is a whole spectrum of reforms that are needed. Some will take more time to show outcomes than others will. One of the general factors we see is important for example, for investment, private sector investment and corporate investment, is the business environment, the ease of doing business, the ability to handle regulations and so on, the amount of red tape, that matters. For example, we did a study which looked at where foreign direct investment was going, and the two bright spots in India are Gujarat and Tamil Nadu. And both of them also rank high in terms of business climate. So there's a strong correlation over there. That, in implementing that countrywide, would be very helpful. Labor reforms are important. So India has the new labor codes. There's a question of implementation. That is still an ongoing process. It will require regulation at the central level, but also incentivizing the state governments to implement the labor codes. That's, again, something that can be done in the near term. Public infrastructure investment, digital infrastructure investment, a lot's been done, but a lot more is still, of course, needed, and that's another area. Trade restrictions, we think, is important. I mean, this is actually going to be a decade of opportunity for India. The world is looking to diversify, looking for other markets to sell to, but also, importantly, other markets to buy from. And India presents that opportunity. You see a huge amount of interest in India right now. So, the only way you're going to get that is if you're also going to be seen as being trade-friendly, because that's usually the path to getting into global supply chains. So these are some of the near-term ones. The more longer-term reforms, of course, are education, skilling. That's going to take time. Land reforms, including clear land titles, agricultural sector reforms. All of these will take time, but can't emphasize enough the importance of human capital and skilling. The skill mismatch is still very large in India. Changing that is going to be very important.
You spoke of keeping trade tariffs low. Given that globally we're seeing a push back against globalization and countries putting up their own protectionist barriers. What do you make of the current set of schemes and policies like production-linked incentives that the government has? They're trying to bring manufacturing into India. The concern is whether that links India adequately with global supply chains. Do you think India is missing a trick over there? What would your policy recommendations be?
The government is right to focus on some of the important areas, and there's the production-linked incentives, and the recent budget had employment-linked incentives, which is another area that requires attention. But the question is, of course, what kind of results it will deliver. We're seeing countries around the world now eager to use policies to stimulate certain sectors in their economy. If you go by history, since it's not the first time this has been tried, it's been tried in the past. If you go by history, those things have tended to be fiscally quite costly and not necessarily terribly effective. So it's important to do the cost-benefit analysis. I'm not saying that it shouldn't be done, but do the cost-benefit analysis and see what the outcomes are. But more broadly, just stepping back, we are concerned about a general environment of trade protectionism that's developing in the world. And this is something that we are cautioning against, just given what we know of how beneficial trade has been in terms of reducing poverty, in terms of maintaining growth rates and technology transfers and so on.